So player versus player is looking to make a triumphant return in Diablo 4. And although players were not able to try it out in the open beta, we were still able to get quite a decent feel of all the classes due to being able to unlock almost all the skills on the skill trees, testing out their respective class mechanics, and also identifying each of their strengths, weaknesses, and playstyles. And of course, there's still a lot we don't know about things like endgame scaling and how PvP will actually play out. But that's why in today's video, we're going to be using a very specific set of criteria to assess specific skills and aspects of each class that are strong or weak for PvP for both solo and group play, which should be helpful information for those who are still unsure about which class to pick and would like to also participate heavily in PvP. So getting into my PvP criteria, and again, this is based solely on class mechanics and utility rather than pure damage numbers, which can and will undoubtedly be tweaked. And of course, ideally, all the classes will eventually be fairly balanced, but even so, there should still yet be specific playstyles, strengths and weaknesses, and roles that emerge. So with that, the way I rank and assess the classes is based on the following. First, whether they have easy to land or even surefire hit attacks. Secondly, how much burst potential they have due to being able to, say, burst through barriers or health potions or other forms of healing, and also to be able to catch players off guard. And next, we also have mobility, crowd control, and unstoppable, which is breaking CC, and how reliably and frequently each class can do these, and whether the classes have other forms of status effects like applying vulnerable or necromancer curses. And then actually as a separate score for each class, group utility is another thing that I look at in terms of synergy with other classes, whether they grant buffs, reliable forms of CC or AoE CC and things like that. And finally, I also try to see whether each class's playstyles actually suits these fields of hatred, which are going to be the PvP zones, and because they actually involve staying relatively within a smaller area, mobility might not be as important, and thus standing your ground, so to speak, and being able to really defend a specific zone might actually play a larger role than people would have expected. And with that, I would like to start with the Sorcerer, which is not only one of the best classes during the beta, but also one that I believe will be extremely powerful and versatile in PvP, both in a solo and group setting, and also a class that I think will demonstrate a lot of the talking points that I have for the rest of this video. And starting with solo PvP play, I would consider the Sorcerer an S tier class, because first of all, a very low cooldown teleports, which not only is a mobility spell but also breaks CC in that it makes you unstoppable, and by skilling up teleport, by getting plus skills to it, you can even lower the cooldown to, I believe, as low as around 5 seconds, assuming Blizzard doesn't change or rebalance the skill later on. And next, Frost Nova looks to be a really powerful PvP ability because not only of its low cooldown, which I believe also can be reduced by skilling up the skill, but you can also get 2 charges of Frost Nova through a legendary power. And this AoE stun on a low cooldown can even grant vulnerable, making it perfect for setting up on enemies, whether it be solo play or during group play. And in terms of the attacks that the sorcerers have, I think many of them are indeed suited for PvP in that they are very easy to hit with, or very fast traveling, or cover a large range, right? So things like Hydra with their fast shooting bolts, assuming they still do enough damage at high levels. Chain Lightning can probably be really strong because you can basically target people with it. And also abilities like Frozen Ore will probably work out as well, being a relatively easy to hit with ability. And besides Hydra, the Sorcerer's other conjuration spells, Ice Blades and Lightning Spear, also seem interesting, especially if they get to do significant amounts of damage, as after you conjure them, they actually automatically seek out targets while you're still able to cast your own spells simultaneously. And the Ice Blades enchantment is also interesting in that whenever it strikes a vulnerable target, your basic cooldowns actually get reduced, so things like Teleport and Frost Nova actually get their cooldowns reduced further, assuming this actually goes into effect with the live game, right? Assuming it doesn't get nerfed. And even if the Ice Barrier enchantment ends up getting changed, the Sorcerer still has some decent defensive abilities like Ice Armor, which will give you a barrier, and also Deep Freeze, which will not only make you invulnerable for a few seconds, but it'll also damage and chill enemies around you. And because of a lot of the aforementioned reasons, I also believe the Sorcerer will be S tier for group play as well, with not only its high mobility teleport, plus Frost Nova being able to set up on enemies by blinking on them and then freezing them with Frost Nova, and also its ability to apply chill and perhaps even freeze and vulnerable to targets while still dealing respectable amounts of damage while even doing all that. And now moving on to the Barbarian, actually for now can only give him a B tier rating for solo and for group play, but I think that they actually can potentially be a lot higher depending on how the scaling works out, right? So as a disclaimer, and this is actually somewhat proven during the beta, in that of all the classes, the Barbarian seems to have the highest potential to scale with gear, given that they're not only able to equip 4 weapons, but that 2 of those weapons are actually two-handers, meaning that they're actually worth a lot more in terms of their stats as well as legendary powers strengths. So depending on how the scaling works out, the Barbarian could actually end up becoming one of the highest scaling characters and just out-damage and perhaps out-survive all the other classes based on their sheer strength and sheer numbers alone. But if we don't consider their super high scaling ceiling, so to speak, just yet, and judge their viability based on class mechanics, I don't think the Barbarian is that powerful for PvP. I would give them a B tier because mainly a lot of their abilities feel like they're not that easy to land. They're kind of slow to cast, so this includes their mobility abilities like charge and leap, as well as CC abilities like kick and ground stomp, and also their core abilities like upheaval and ancient's hammer also feel pretty slow casting, and they're pretty much melee abilities with the exception of, say, upheaval. They just seem kind of hard to land, especially against higher mobility classes. However, given the nature of PvP in Diablo 4 seeming like you do have to hold your ground, so to speak, within a smaller area, the Barbarian could actually be good at doing that in terms of guarding a specific zone in the Fields of Hatred, right? Because the gameplay actually involves turning in currencies to a static altar, and so the Barbarian can kind of stay there. For example, if you're going to be playing group PvP, they can actually be in charge of guarding the shrine, for instance, and I think they could actually manage that decently well. And not only that, but I also think that Barbarians will likely dominate in terms of like a melee straight on brawl against like melee rogues and druids. So they actually do have that going for them, and that they can probably check some of the other melee specs out there. One thing though that the Barb sort of has going for it is that it has lots of ways to become unstoppable and thus break CC, and even without like super instantaneous like movement abilities like with the Sorceress, they can still run really fast, especially if they combine Unstoppable with Berserking and abilities like Wrath of the Berserker. And by running fast enough, especially in a small zone, PvP zone, that could actually be enough to win out in those scenarios. And as for group utility, the Barb has traditionally been quite a good character for that because of their shouts and like war cries, but I think they can actually be somewhat overrated for that, because you have to note that both Rallying Cry and War Cry, while powerful, only last for half the duration on party members, right? This could actually be different depending on like legendary powers and stuff, but from what I can see, their effect seems to be not that great, especially in the face of what characters like the Sorcerer can do. And now on to another class that I believe will be an absolute powerhouse in PvP, and that's also one of my favorite classes in the beta, the Rogue. Now I had actually wanted to put her in the S tier alongside the Sorcerer, but later on decided to bump her down just a little bit to A tier, because especially I think the melee Rogue can potentially have problems going up against and brawling with characters like the Barbarian and melee variants of the Druid. But besides that potential weakness, the Rogue's kit is simply insane for PvP. Not only with its mobility skills like Dash and Shadow Step, both of which have short cooldowns, with Dash even having 2 charges, and Shadow Step allowing you to not only move around the battlefield but also actually teleport behind your target, meaning that it actually basically guarantees a melee hit, such as with Twisting Blades if you want to follow it up with that. And not only that, but Shadow Step also allows the Rogue to become unstoppable and break CC if need be. And on top of that, Concealment, which is their stealth ability, allows them to vanish from sight, literally, from your enemy's sight, and also become unstoppable, and then also allow you to basically ambush your enemies or have an additional way to ambush your enemies in addition to Shadow Step, right? And not only that, but Shadow Clone is an ultimate ability that allows the cloning of all of your abilities at somewhat reduced effectiveness, which is yet another trigger for Unstoppable, giving the rogue basically 3 buttons to break out of CC. So even against a sorcerer with double Frost Novas, if they have Shadow Clone up, they should have more than enough CC breaks to stay on top of that target. Another strength of the rogue is not only really high damage and burst damage through stacking cooldowns like the imbuements as well as the aforementioned Shadow Clone, but also by being able to generate energy really quickly, passively, without even necessarily having to use any basic abilities. So especially for the melee rogue, I foresee that they don't even have to equip a basic ability and will still have enough energy to execute their enemies essentially, especially if they spec into the energy generation from Concealment as well. And in terms of the rogue's range abilities, they seem fine as well and can be imbued and amplified with the aforementioned damage cooldowns as well. And they're also fairly fast traveling or have a large enough range to hit enemies with. And there's even a Heartseeker basic ability that homes in on targets like Guided Arrow or Hungering Arrow from the past games. But another thing that I really want to highlight is the rogue's versatility in terms of being able to spec melee or ranged or even be a hybrid, or perhaps even with the right gear and keeping gear in your inventory, be able to spec into or more heavily into one or the other depending on the situation on the fly. And lastly, one thing that I do think the rogue might be a bit weaker at compared to the other classes is group utility, which could still potentially be offset with the rogue's ability to basically just pick off targets one by one without even much help. But regardless, the rogue doesn't seem to offer as much in terms of pure group utility, except for using their Frost Imbue to apply some chill, vulnerability, as well as from some of their other abilities, and lastly, Daze. And onto the Druid, which is probably the weakest class during the beta, but is also notably the only class that did not have its class mechanic unlocked during the beta, which means when it is unlocked for the live game, the Druid should become significantly stronger. And also I think it could use perhaps some numbers tuning as well, especially with its spirit costs or spirit regeneration. However, even given those assumptions, I'm currently assigning the Druid a B tier for solo play, but an A tier for group play. So first of all, again, it'll likely become stronger than what we saw in the beta, but one of the core problems that the Druid has, besides the attacks not being as spammable, and even if they get a spirit regen buff, is that a lot of their attacks just feel slow in general. Not only in terms of casting them, but like when they activate, if an enemy player has mobility skills or even just high movement speed, or even just using boots that grant 2 charges of evade, they should be able to pretty easily dodge out of a lot of the Druid's attacks. But one thing that the Druid does kind of have going for it is the ability to lock down the targets and immobilize them or stun them. For example, there's a passive that allows storm spells to have a chance to immobilize targets. Plus their Vine Creeper is a reliable AoE immobilize that'll surely be great for group play. And in addition to that, Petrify offers an AoE stun. And I think all these spells will work great for group play and for the Fields of Hatred playstyle especially, which again involves contesting specific small areas. And besides being able to offer AoE stuns and immobilizes for his group, the Druid also has several ways to make targets vulnerable also in an AoE. And earlier I mentioned that the Druid's spells are generally a bit slow or difficult to land, which can definitely be alleviated by having these AoE stuns and immobilizes, right? Not to mention, the Druid is actually then also a great class to have other party members support and set up, say with the Sorcerer's Frost Nova or other forms of CC, because by being able to land his landslides, for example, reliably and basically deal these guaranteed crits, or pulverize with its guaranteed overpower, the Druid can actually still do tons of burst damage. And another very interesting thing about the Druid scaling is that its primary stat is actually willpower, which actually not only increases your skill damage directly, but also increases overpower damage. So it's kind of a double increase in your damage, so to speak, if you decide to go for a Fortify, which is a tankier build, right? Which will allow you to overpower. So you can actually build tanky and deal tons of damage because you build tanky as well. And finally, onto the Necromancer, and I'm probably gonna get some hate for this, but let me explain. So despite how strong the Necromancer was, and it was undoubtedly one of the best classes in the beta, if not the strongest, I actually put him in the C tier for solo PvP and the B tier for group PvP. And there are several reasons for this, but I think the most obvious one is that a lot of the aspects that make the Necromancer good in PvE do not translate well or are even somewhat antithetical to PvP. For instance, his minions, I don't anticipate them to have a very large impact in PvP, even though you can choose to sacrifice them for a personal buff in the Book of the Dead. That could make the Necromancer stats-wise quite strong. But in terms of tanking damage or focus firing enemies like you could actually command your skeletons to do in the previous iterations of the Necro, you can't do that anymore in Diablo 4. So not only can you not control which targets the skeletons are attacking or your golem as well, but players are also just gonna ignore them if you have them summoned and just try to damage your character instead, right? Unless it's like some sort of AoE spread ability that can have like bullets, right? Like from the rogue, for example, that your skeleton army can potentially absorb. It can potentially be decent for those specific types of matchups. And something else that makes the Necromancer really good in PvE is the ability to generate corpses, which is kind of a free-ish resource. By killing monsters, you can get these corpses that you can then use on your abilities, right? Like corpse tendrils and more notably corpse explosion. But in PvP, and I actually somewhat experienced this while fighting the Ashava world boss as well, but there doesn't seem to be really any good ways to generate corpses if there aren't really any, groups of monsters around, right? So in a PvP scenario, you'll probably have a more difficult time generating corpses as well, which if your minions are going to be dying more easily too, that could just mean that you will be somewhat corpse starved. And there have been reports of minions starting to become more squishy at higher levels or difficulties, which I imagine will even be more significant and more of a case at higher levels and during PvP. Another potential weakness of the Necromancer is the lack of mobility. They literally have no mobility abilities if you don't count Blood Mist, which just makes you invulnerable for a while. Although you can move around with it, it actually reduces your movement speed without the legendary power, but also doesn't really do much else while you're in Blood Mist. Unlike, for example, if you're a sorcerer and you can conjure stuff and then go immune, you can, in PvE, go immune and still have your minions doing damage to your enemies, right? While you're still within that immunity state. But in PvP, again, as I mentioned, I don't think minions are going to be as powerful as in PvE. And also, the Necromancer doesn't seem to have that many reliable, easy to hit and bursty abilities. Some of them require melee range as well. There are a couple that fly pretty quickly, like the Bloodlance as well as Bone Spear, but I'm really not sure they'll be that powerful single target. Now, Bone Prison could actually be a spell to set up some of these abilities and also act as a good group utility CC setup spell. But note that it's not a hard CC, it doesn't add a status effect to your opponents, but rather just traps them within this sort of circular wall with health points that they can actually damage their way out of, or even use mobility spells to get out of, right? Because they're not going to be stunned. And for group play, Decrepify could be pretty decent as well for a decently large area and easy to land debuff. Now, one cool and potentially powerful aspect about the Necromancer though is the ability to also build and synergize with tankiness and also healing with their blood spells, especially with the ability to equip a shield, which from the looks of it can actually offer quite a lot of damage reduction as well. And by specializing hard into blood spells, which will allow the Necromancer to fortify and heal, and also adding this damage reduction with field style static, not moving much type PvP, the Necromancer could actually excel at holding down a specific point. And those are my preliminary Diablo 4 PvP class rankings. Let me know whether you agree or if you have parts that you might disagree with. Be sure to comment down below, and all opinions are welcome here, and I'll also be sure to reply to your comments as well. Anyhow, like the video if you liked it or found it helpful. Be sure to subscribe to my channel for more, and with that I will catch you in the next video. Peace.